Hey everyone, you're listening to another episode of Divergent Conversations podcast. I'm your co-host 𝗿𝗶𝘀cie his𝗍.
And I'm Dr. Duff.
And today we are going to talk about our journey into becoming therapists and maybe what we would be doing if we weren't masking and if we weren't therapists. So Megan, you wanted to start this topic up, so take it away.
Yeah. I guess I've got kind of two prongs that have informed my interest in this topic. One, I get this in my DMs and my emails a lot from either students who are going through programs, autistic ADHD students going through programs who are interacting with the ableism in the system and just being like, how did you do this? How do you become a therapist? Do I come out as an autistic therapist? So one, just I get a lot of questions around this. And then the second reason, or people who aren't necessarily in training, but they're thinking about going into training, but they're terrified about the process of becoming an autistic therapist. The second reason is I did something kind of impulsive, but like also I've been thinking about it for a few years, but I don't know if you're like this, where you're thinking about something and then you just are like, yes, and then you're all in. So I did that where I applied for a psychoanalytic relational institute that would start next year. And whenever you're applying for things like programs or internships, the classic question is, why did you become a therapist? And I typically start with some like beautiful Martin Buber quote. Martin Buber is a Jewish philosopher who is definitely a special interest of mine, who talks a lot about like authentic human encounter. But what I found myself saying instead of some Martin Buber quote, for the first time, I said, I became a therapist because I'm autistic. And so much of the messaging is we become therapists despite our autism versus like because of our autism. So that just started a train of thought this last week. I was really curious about around the intersection of how autism informed me becoming a therapist, how it influences, and then for other people as well who might be interested in entering this profession. That was a very long-winded way of answering your question, Patrick.
No, I think it's a perfectly Megan Anna way of answering my question. So
it is a very autistic Megan Anna way of answering your question. I like barely remember what your question was at this point, but I think it was something about why the heck are we talking about this today?
And so you're talking about the DMs you're getting from people who are experiencing ableism in their program. How the hell did you get this? When do I start? Like, when do I come out and openly disclose? Right? That's a piece. But you mentioned like, did I become a therapist because I'm autistic instead of in spite of? Can you kind of go a little deeper on that? Like, elaborate more on what you mean by that? Because I'm curious for the audience. Like, so if you are coming to terms with, I became a therapist because I'm autistic, tell us about what that means for you.
Yeah. Gosh, there's so many ways that inform that. I think one of the first things that comes to my mind is the hot potato phenomena. So I'm curious if you relate to this, but ever since I was little, like I've struggled with social based questions, which is very common for autistic people. So even now, like my sister, who I'm fairly close with, when we interact, she'll often start with, how are you? And now I'm comfortable just being like, I don't know how to answer that, Sarah. But when I was younger, whenever someone would ask me a question about my personhood, I'd have kind of that mini freeze response. So it felt like I was holding the hot potato in the conversation. And it was like, okay, how do I get them holding the hot potato? And I became very strategic with getting the other person talking. And here's the thing, people like to talk about themselves. And so I learned that pretty young. And so I got really skilled as an adaptation to my social struggles at drawing the other person out. And this is what's so interesting, right? If you look closely at my dialogues throughout life, I do struggle with reciprocal communication, but it wasn't obvious because what I was doing was I was not the reciprocal person in many of my conversations. I was drawing the other person out, getting them talking. So people wouldn't leave a conversation being like, that was weird. They'd usually leave a conversation being like, oh, I felt seen and understood, and that person's really curious about me. And that was a really sophisticated adaptation to my social struggles. So that's one reason. I'm curious first, like hot potato phenomena. Do you relate to that at all?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that it's such a great way to turn the conversation around and take the pressure and the focus off of you, and
Mm-hmm.
to say like, "Oh, I'm uncomfortable, but I know how to make this person comfortable, and I can be that mirror for them. I can be that place to reflect and
Yeah.
be really curious and be really interested." And learning that at such a young age is so fascinating when we start thinking back about childhood experience and how we kind of navigated the world and made it safe, quote unquote, safe for ourselves. And I think that that obviously does allow for that person to feel taken care of. It allows them to
Mm-hmm.
feel heard and validated and seen, coming away from the conversation probably like, Megan is the
Mm-hmm.
best fucking friend in the world. They listen so well. Like they make me feel so much better. And I think that also maybe at such a young age does something to our own sense of self when someone's
Oh
like,
my
"Oh,
gosh.
you're
Yeah.
really good at this. Like
Yeah.
you are really good
Yeah.
listener,
Yeah.
caretaker, uh, whatever the um,
And that
qualifier is
becomes
that
their
you want
sense
to
of
use."
self-worth and value. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, because it's our social currency, and I knew that, like, this is how I developed social currency, and it also like, yes, it was more comfortable for the other person, but it was also more comfortable for me, like, those conversations also did feel good to me because it felt like, for when I genuinely am curious about people, so that probably helps, but it just felt good to be that presence. I noticed that it was really interesting in my doctoral program. What I noticed was I struggled to get close to people in my cohort. And what I did is I took on a role of mentor, like I TA'd all the classes. And when I looked at my week, I was like, all of my social interactions are mentorships. And so becoming a mentor is how I figured out a way to socially connect in a way that worked because of the hot potato. Like that's your role when you're a mentor is to create space for the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fulfilling a lot of different needs by taking on that mentorship role or that helper role.
Mhm,
And it's also, I think, thinking about my own journey into becoming a helper and a therapist is just the fact that it takes so much of the pressure, again, like you're saying,
mhm,
off of ourselves to have to be
yeah,
the center of attention. And I think if you're used to that and that's been kind of your experience for throughout life, it is a really great profession because I'm not in there to
mhm,
talk about myself. I'm not in there. I do
mhm,
disclose. I think that's necessary for connecting with any sort of neurodivergent client of mine. But like, I also just know and acknowledge that this 60 minutes doesn't have to be about me. And that's
mm-mm,
really that takes all the pressure off of like,
mhm,
how am I
mhm,
supposed to show up and act and engage and
mhm,
interact?
yeah, and it provides such a tight frame, like the 60 minutes. So I think we briefly mentioned we're both avoidant attached, like our structure, but I love intense, authentic connection, which I also think is an autistic thing, which I think is one reason I became a therapist is my craving for the authentic. Um, but I really struggle with maintenance of friendships. Like I don't have friends, Patrick. Like you are probably the closest thing to a friend in my life right now. And it's because we have a frame around work that we interact. Like I don't really do friendship partly because of the maintenance. And for a long time, friends, when I have had them, they've felt like a thing to maintain. I realize that sounds terrible, but I think has to do with how limited my social resources are. The fact that when I do have friends, I struggle to bring myself versus kind of foster conversation. So there's a lot of things that go into that. But what I love about therapy is it's a tight frame. I am present to that person for 60 minutes and I'm very present. And that's the frame. It's there's not a expectation. I mean, obviously there's charting and if there's like email correspondence that needs to happen, but there's not expectations outside of that frame around how you're going to maintain this relationship. Whereas in other relationships, it's like, well, you haven't texted me for 6 weeks, or you haven't, like, there's all that maintenance that goes into it that's really, really hard for me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a good point. And I just want to circle back. I feel honored to be
My only friend.
yeah, you're your only friend right now.
Do you have friends?
I do. Yeah. I mean, I find it challenging. Like it's a weird trying to think of I'm trying to put cohesive thoughts together right now. Um
It's hard.
it is hard. I think that my experience is that people often are more attracted to me socially or in terms of friendship
Mhm.
than I am to them.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I
I have
get
a
that.
lot of people who consider me to be like one of their closer
Uh-huh,
friends when in reality I don't really know that much about them nor do they
huh,
know that much about me. So that's always a strange dynamic. Um but I mean I've always been a part of soccer teams and just I think that having that type of like cohesive camaraderie has been really helpful
mhm,
for me because you don't really have to show up to a team sport with the intention of making friendships or developing relationships. It's like you're there for a common goal, right? Like our
it's
goal
parallel play. Yeah,
exactly. And you're
yeah.
there to just perform as a unit. And like
Sounds so nice. Yeah.
that's my solace. Like I'm not a religious human being, but when I get to the soccer fields, it's like my teammates still to this day will make fun of me because I show up like an hour early and they'll show up like 12 minutes before kickoff. And I'm like, how are you fucking doing this? Like I need to stretch. But I just find that that is the one place in my life where I have like just complete relief
Mm,
where you and I have talked about that constant buzz and that discomfort and that anxiety and the
mhm,
everything that is our experience. But like that is the place where that is gone. It's just vacancy. It's just like complete
mm,
silence. And I think that for me is the most
mm.
peaceful place on earth. I realize
Yeah.
I'm diverging way over here now. Um, but yes, I do have some friends.
Mhm,
I would say that I still, even if I have people who I like a lot and I spend time with and I consistently communicate with, I still feel disconnected from them.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I don't feel like I don't feel like we're like always attuned or in sync because I think I also keep myself at a distance and we have to if we socialize, it's gotta be at my house. It's gotta be at the places I feel
Mhm,
going, and I
mhm,
can imagine that's challenging for some of them who are like, "I don't wanna fucking go to this place, like, for the 100th time, like, I don't wanna come to your house. How come you never come to my house?" But,
mm,
I mean, that is the
mhm.
nature of a lot of my relationships for sure,
Yeah, yeah.
and a
Well,
lot
I
of
mean,
internet friends
we're
too.
on a rabbit we're on a rabbit trail, but maybe not. I also wonder, so one of the things I learned early in the, like, autism research discovery phase was how autistic people do better in kinda structured social interactions where they have a frame. So, like, it could be as simple as if you're at a party, you become the person that washes the dishes. Like, you have a role, and that's so helpful, and I so resonate with that. That I wonder if part of becoming a therapist is it gives a role to the really deep way of interacting with other humans. And so it is a more tolerable way of socially connecting, and a way of connecting really deeply and really meaningfully. So I wonder if the struggle around social connection and the desire for social connection is one of the reasons that we became therapists, or that other autistic people might become therapists.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I also wanna give you credit for looping me back in, it's usually the other way back around, so,
Are you
um
more in your ADHD brain today?
majorly. I've got Ireland coming up next week. My brain is so
Mhm,
scattered. But I think you're right. I think it's that deep desire to have connection and having
mhm,
that regimented, structured, almost like
mhm.
this is what to expect in this environment. This is what's
Yep.
allowable. This is what's not. This
Mhm,
is what we talk about. This is what we don't.
mhm,
And we have these
mhm,
clear boundaries for the most part of like, okay, after that 60 minutes, not that you don't think
mhm.
about your feelings after that 60 minutes, but,
Right.
like, you don't have the pressure and responsibility is no longer on you,
Mhm,
and I do think that it allows you to have that human connection, that empathy that so many people misconstrue and misunderstand like the mythology of like autistic people can't be empathetic and they can't like
Mhm,
connect with
mhm,
other people, and that's fucking
mhm.
bullshit. But
Right, right.
it
So
does
many
have
of
to
us are
be
hyper
deep
empathetic.
connection,
Yeah,
right? Like it has to be deep. You mentioned depth connection, and I think
yeah, yeah.
therapy allows you to have
Mhm.
consistent depth connection.
And which is so like it's so the word oxygen is coming to my mind. It's oxygenating to have deep human connections. The small talk is not oxygenating for us. It's not. I saw a study once that like small talk releases dopamine for non-autistic people's brain. I was like, wow, that must be nice. No wonder they do this nonsensical thing. Um, but one thing I told my therapist a while back was, and forgive me if I've said this on this podcast before, but I was like, I feel like I don't have social ligaments. Like, so the ligaments are what make our body move, but I'm really good when we get into the muscle. So like once I'm in a deep conversation, I'm good. But the transition, the small talk, getting into that conversation, getting out of it, and therapy, it's mostly all muscle, especially now that I work primarily with autistic clients. We just jump right in. Like I love it. My clients we don't do the like small talk 5 minute. When I was working with non-autistic clients, there would still be like typically a 5 minute small talk before you get into the session. And with autistic clients, it's more likely just like, okay, this is what's on my mind. Let's go. um, so I
Yeah.
love that is that it's okay. I don't have social ligaments as a therapist.
Yeah, I think that takes a lot of that unnecessary energy, emotional labor and energy for us out of the equation.
Mhm,
When, and I've been trying to be mindful, not just for our sake and the dynamic, but like my own sake of like when we get into the Zoom room, not being like, Megan, how are you doing? And then you looking at me and be like, "Well, stop fucking asking me that."
I literally was just thinking about it, how I was like, Patrick, can we just hit record when we get into the Zoom room? I wonder if that was my way of saying, like, can we just get to the muscle and not try and do the social ligament thing? Cause I don't
I
like
think
that.
that's it. And it
Yeah.
helps me too, because I don't like it
Hmm.
either. And I think that it's just allowing for that state where you feel the most at home or natural or at peace in terms of however we can do those things. And I just think that as a therapist, having that empathetic reflection process, going deep, being curious, asking questions, like it's really a lovely experience and one that we don't often have in our day to day. And
Hmm.
it makes me think of clients who I had starting off, like in private practice, where I didn't know I was autistic. I also didn't know who I was as a therapist. I was just like trying to
Hmm.
figure out how to be in private practice. And the artificiality, the small talk, the clients who weren't ready to go deeper, the clients who weren't a great fit or who
Hmm.
probably, it just felt like pulling teeth a lot of the time. And I just
Hmm.
noticed how irritated I would get and how like bored I would get too, where I was
Yeah.
just like,
Yeah.
okay, like, can do we really talk
Hmm.
about this thing over and over and over
Hmm.
again?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think, I want to think about one thing too. Like, we are so good at absorbing other people's energy and picking
Hmm.
up on how people are experiencing the world, especially people who are struggling. Like, we have that fucking radar where we're like, I can tell this person's really having a
Hmm.
hard time. And you and I talked about this last week where we were talking about like talking to just folks who maybe were homeless and
Hmm.
people who were
Yeah.
struggling, people who were just like really obviously having a hard time to us, and just really picking up on that and wanting to be curious, wanting to talk, wanting to
Hmm.
support. And I think that helps with being a good therapist because that intuition, that ability to read body language so quickly because we've gotten so accustomed to having to do that, and
Right.
facial expressions and eye movement and everything that goes into
Hmm.
tracking because we're tracking all the time anyway.
So, okay, h- here's a provocative question. We're talking about the traumatized parts of being autistic, right? The adaptations we made to socially blend in, the hypervigilance we have needed to have around other people to decode their body language, and how that has made us therapists. So essentially, I think we're saying we became therapists out of our trauma. So what do we do with that when we're both therapists? Well, actually, you're not. Let's pretend you're still seeing clients. We're both in this profession, and we now are looking back and like, oh, my trauma brought me here. Does that like does that take the meaning away for you? Does that like how does that shape how you think about this profession if our trauma is what brought us here? And I think that's too reductionistic of a narrative. I realize it's also our empathy, but it's a both and it's a mixed narrative. But it does seem like our autistic trauma around masking is a big piece for both of us that brought us to this profession. So does that shape how you experience it for you?
That's such a good question. I think that my conceptualization of being a therapist, because for those of you who don't know, I also am a therapist in private practice, an entrepreneur coach. So like a lot of my
Mhm,
time is spent with therapists now, not
mhm,
clients of therapy, but therapists who are working on the emotional and psychological side of business ownership. And this is just my take on therapists in general, not just autistic therapists, that so many therapists have become therapists because of their trauma histories, because of
yeah,
their own
yeah,
healing journeys.
it's true.
And but here's the thing that I think happens. A lot of therapists get into this work to heal their trauma through the work that they
Mhm,
do.
yep. Which is fine if you have awareness that that's what's happening. It's really dangerous if that's happening and you're unaware. That's where therapists can do a lot of harm, I think.
Absolutely. A
Yeah.
hundred, 100%. Like everyone who's a therapist has their own story, has their own struggles,
Mhm,
we're humans. I mean, we've all experienced it. It probably was a catalyst and a positive factor in terms of what do I want to be when I grow up, which
mhm,
I don't know how to
mhm,
fucking answer that anyway. But I still don't know at 36 what the
mhm,
fuck I want to be when I grow up. Um, but I do think like without that awareness, yes, very damaging. But everyone has gotten into this field for a reason. But
mhm,
the difference, I think, is what I see with autistic therapists is that you're not necessarily trying to heal yourself through the work that you're doing. You were brought to the work because of
mhm,
the masking trauma and
mhm.
trauma that you've endured throughout life. But that's your only way of acknowledging how to be. So I don't know
Yeah.
if like
Yeah.
necessarily changes because you're helping other people understand this and process their own emotions and feelings. Like
Mhm,
I just think that when I'm in the therapy room, this is the only way I know how to be, and the therapy room is the only place that I'm actually allowed to do this in a way
mhm,
where it's actually professionally helpful
mhm,
in that
mhm.
lens, because that's the only way I know how to show up. But you have to mask so often in so many other arenas. You don't always get to show up like this.
Mhm.
And as a therapist, especially like yourself, Megan, like working specifically with autistic clients, I imagine that feels so fucking freeing for you in the work
Yeah,
that
it's amazing.
yeah,
Yeah.
like you already know going into these
Mhm,
relationships, I get to just show up and be
mhm.
real. And I
Yeah.
think that feels really liberating. And a
Mhm.
lot of people don't get to experience that.
Yeah. Yeah, it does feel really different when I'm and I it's been a while, but, even last year, I had some people I was working with who weren't neurodivergent, and, um, it y I don't do that anymore, and it's for a reason. It's because it feels really it does feel a lot more like masking. Um, yeah, it feels so freeing. It's the biggest, kind of privilege and gift to come out of the last 2 years is the ability to pivot to work with autistic clients, and I really feel for therapists who, A, aren't out, and so and B, aren't able to curate their client load in that way because it's really hard.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and it's really hard, and that's where the misfiring happens. That's
Mhm,
when you start to doubt your ability as a therapist too, because the outcomes
mhm,
aren't there, the relationships aren't being established, and
mhm,
that goes further than autistic therapists in general. I mean, that's just rapport
mhm,
101. But I do think for us, it's an even deeper, more important, even like absolutely necessary component of the work that we do.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And partly I became it's so interesting. If you saw me work as a therapist a couple years to how I am now, it's just so different. Like I n- before I would rarely self-disclose. Like if someone's, do you have children? I'd maybe say yes, but then I'd like think through the pros and cons of self-disclosing that and maybe ask them like why they needed to know that, all that like y- turn around of like, well, what would that mean to you if I had children? I self-disclose so much now, and I still am very reflective of why am I self-disclosing? Who is this for? Like I've got my kind of filter I run through. But I think it was actually on a podcast you did with 𝗿𝗶𝘀𝘁𝗶 where you talked about this, how like autistic people need like we need autistic mentors in the sense of we need our like we don't have stories. And so sharing from our lived experience in the context of therapy can be really appropriate. And I come from a more like psychodynamic lens where self-disclosure is very restrictive. So that's been a really interesting shift in my therapy to think about self-disclosure so differently. But I'm just so different in the therapy room as a therapist than I was 2 years ago.
That's interesting to see the transition and evolution. And I'm thinking about my own journey too. Like I haven't seen therapy clients in about 6 months now, but um, the ones that I was seeing before my throat surgery were all neurodivergent clients, and most of
Mhm.
them were coming to terms with being autistic. And I
Mhm.
just realized that you start to really attract the right clients when you're able to
Mhm.
unmask and disclose yourself. Like as a professional, it really does empower the client to say, like, fuck, finally, a therapist is
Mhm.
gonna get it. Instead of like
Mhm.
having to guess if you're gonna understand or be
Mhm.
affirmative.
Yeah.
And I know we can do I think we have an idea to do an episode about seeking out neurodivergent affirmative or neurodiversity affirmative therapy.
Mhm.
And you're playing this guessing game a lot of the time if someone doesn't come out and say, this is who I
Right.
specialize in working with and why.
Yeah.
And, I do think that disclosure piece is so crucial. And, processing special interests in therapy is
Mhm.
unbelievably therapeutic. But then
Yeah.
if you get caught up in the like, well, how do I present this to the insurance company? And how do I talk about the fact that we like
Uh-huh.
talked about Lord of the Rings for 60 minutes and like, what?
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
so unbelievably validating for you to
Mhm.
be able to support someone who's autistic by diving deep into their special interests.
I think you call that we engaged in co-regulation and self-soothing. But that is what makes it like therapy, right? It's at the end of the hour, then it's like, where were you during this hour? What was that like for you for us to connect in this way? And that reflection then at the end of talking about special interests or connecting in ways that might not typically be thought of as therapeutic. That's I think what then makes it therapeutic is then it's like, oh yeah, I do feel connected to you, and it's because we were having an object-based conversation, not a social-based conversation, or we were connecting around interests, not this. I had a thought, and then I think it's gone. Um, but I am a little curious because the other part, unless I'm like cutting off thoughts that you have around this, but the other part of the conversation was around people who are maybe in training programs or thinking about going through training programs. Like I've heard some pretty horrendous stuff from people, like things such as my professor said that you can't be autistic and a therapist. Like this is the kind of things they're hearing in classes and from their professors, um, which I think, I mean, not even to talk about just the executive functioning and sensory overload of making it through a program, but to be hearing from your professors things such as autistic people can't be therapists. Um, like, do you have any words of encouragement, or like, what would you say to people who are thinking about entering this profession, who are in training? I'm giving you the hot potato by saying, what are your words of encouragement for this really
Well,
tough?
I think what immediately comes up is kind of like rage. So then I have
Yeah.
to center myself to think about how I want to respond appropriately. One, if you're listening to this and you're in a program and that's your experience, I think that we both just want to send you our deepest, sincerest apologies, because not only can you be a therapist as an autistic person, you can be a fucking wonderful therapist as an autistic person. Your abilities to show up authentically sets you apart from those who cannot. And I know so many therapists who went through a program, and don't even get me started on the assembly line process of grad school at this point in time, but who
Mm,
just have never done their own deep,
yeah.
reflective, depth
Yeah.
oriented work.
Mhm.
And I believe wholeheartedly that that sets us apart, because if you're willing to go deep and you're willing to have the hard conversations, you're going to be able to hold that space for your clients. You're going to be able to show up the way that they need you to show up. When the conversation takes a turn from your connections and associations with the Lord of the Rings to like, hey, I'm actively suicidal and struggling with A,
Mhm.
B, and C. You can't show up for your clients if you cannot be in that space. Like, if you can't go
Mhm.
deep, if you can't sit with that discomfort, if you can't mirror back and forth, if you
Mhm.
can't really pick up on what's happening behind the scenes for your clients, like these are so
Mhm.
important.
Yeah.
And you are all so gifted at doing these things. We're going to hear this, right? Like, from professors, from agency, community mental health providers, and supervisors are like, you can't have these accommodations. You can't stim in
Mhm.
class. You can't move. You can't fidget. You're disruptive. The same shit that we've heard all of our lives, or some professors pushing ABA therapy, or whatever the case may be. But in reality, like, there's such a big movement right now. And Megan, I'm proud to say that you're one of the people leading that charge in terms of like showing up and helping destigmatize and work on depathologizing what it's like to be an autistic human being.
Mhm. Yeah. 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 Well, thanks for like taking the hot potato and you have a way with words that I don't. Like you should be in charge of the encouragement pieces on the podcast. I'm not able to encourage in the same way that you are, and which is probably why I'm an analytic therapist and not like a no, but thank you. That was moving to hear you say those words.
Thanks. And, I think we can have a whole episode on this. Maybe that informs next week's conversation, but not only how to seek support as a grad school student or a new therapist in the profession,
Mhm.
how to find your own ND affirmative therapy. Like, we've got to be talking about this more.
Yeah, absolutely. I just put up a handful of directories on my website, which we can link to. And thankfully, like the directories that are out there are, I mean, they're small, but they're growing every week to where I think it's becoming more of a feasible option. Even a year ago, because that is the number one DM I get is like, help me find a therapist.
Yep.
And in the last year, I've seen a lot of growth, and I think it will continue to. So yeah, there are some neurodivergent affirming directories, or even just knowing like what to search for, what to ask. We should definitely do a podcast on that. That would be really helpful.
This will help me next week when I message you and I'm like, what do you want to talk about today? But
Yeah,
now we
let's
can.
talk about how to find a neurodivergent affirming therapist and like yeah, like what questions you should ask. One of the things that's hard is it's so hard to find any therapist right now without a wait list, that like the interview process of interviewing your therapist to become your therapist isn't really happening in the same way. Um, because just getting in with any therapist for most people is kind of the goal. If you're in crisis, if you are wanting to do the deeper reflective work and can wait on a wait list for 6 months, then you've got more options.
Yeah, and we can talk about that next week too.
Yeah.
I have group practice. I have 15 therapists who work at that practice. It's so hard to turn clients away when you know that they can't find that support anywhere else.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. When
so
you
that
can't refer them. Yeah. It's so
uh,
hard.
it's so hard, and it's so much more than just saying like, we have ND lived experience, right? Autistic group
Mhm.
practice owner, autistic clinicians, ADHD clinicians. You got to do the work too. I mean, it's not as simple as
Yeah.
just like saying I'm an anti-oppressive, uh,
Right.
Black Lives
Right.
Matter.
These are
Anti-racist therapist, you gotta do the fucking work.
yeah, these are easy words to say now, but it's like, okay, the language is right, but does it match? Is the person doing the work? I love that. Yeah.
Are the values consistent? And it does mean hiring consultants and trainers to come in
Yeah.
with lived experience who are experts in the field to
Mhm.
help you continue to grow. Again, I'm diverging. I wanna talk quickly, I'm just being aware of time too. Um, the double empathy binds
Oh,
here too.
yeah.
I want to talk about that because what happens, right, is we mentioned this, alluded to this earlier. And a lot of you who are listening who may become therapists in grad school programs, are therapists, whatever the case may be, may have been told by society that autistic people cannot be empathetic, cannot
Mhm.
hold space, cannot be attuned. Megan, your thoughts?
Oh, yeah, I love the double
Asking
empathy.
the hot
Yeah,
potato.
I love Milton's work. Um, and so did you know that they, like, did an empirical study to follow up with this theory? Okay, so can I dump for, like, 5 minutes? So,
Sure.
yeah, the theory comes from Damian Milton. I think I've got that name right. I'll correct it in the notes if not, but I believe he's a sociologist in the UK, um, who is autistic, and it's this idea that and it by empathy, so there's different kinds of empathy, and what he's really talking, I think, primarily about cognitive empathy and perspective taking and this whole, like, theory of mind idea of, yes, autistic people struggle to understand neurotypical people's theory of mind, but also the neurotypical or allistic person struggles to understand the autistic theory of mind. But autistic people understand autistic people. So it's a cross neurotype interaction. It's not that there is a deficit in the autistic person's theory of mind or ability to consider the subjectivity of another person. So there's a follow up study done by another group of researchers. They're like, let's test this theory. So what they did is they had groups of dyads. So they had three different groups. They had autistic to autistic pairings, non-autistic, non-autistic, and then autistic, non-autistic pairings. And they had them either do some sort of activity or have a conversation that was structured. And then after the interaction, they each rated the rapport. And rapport is just like how easy was it to connect with the other person. Now, if we're going with the deficit model of autism, you would think that the autistic to autistic partners would struggle the most because you'd have two people with social communication deficits trying to interact, right? And so if that's true, then that would be the worst. And then the autistic, non-autistic pairing, the non-autistic person could, like, hold up, you know, the non-autistic person by all of their social awesomeness. Um, but if the double empathy problem was right, then you wouldn't see that. And that's exactly what they found. They found the rapport was the highest among non-autistic, non-autistic, second highest among autistic, autistic, and lowest among autistic, non-autistic. So cross neurotype. They did a follow-up study where people were watching videos and reported them, and the autistic, autistic parents were actually the highest rapport of observers, which was really interesting. So what this research essentially shows is that it is a cross neurotype interaction that makes it harder to build rapport, harder to understand what the other person's thinking, not an autistic, like, innate deficit that is baked into us. It is a dynamic that happens between two people.
I love the way you laid that out. And that just speaks volumes to how ableism has misconstrued how we kind of perceive autistic people to be able to interact to. And
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think that we can say that it's you can all think about your friend groups and your social relationships or anyone that you feel connected to. And I would encourage you to think about that, like neurotype interaction and communication. How easy does it feel to fall into communication and conversation and socializing? How easy does it feel to be able to build connection and rapport? And as therapists, this is a crucial component of our work. Building rapport is the foundation. I think if you don't have
Hmm.
it, it doesn't matter how good of a therapist you are, the client's not going to have a great therapeutic experience and vice versa.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
just speaks volumes to the ability to do so and to really come alongside and easily kind of drop into relationships. So I do think that's a really important thing to remember. And Megan, again, love the way you laid that out very, very clearly too.
Yeah, I love that study, because I think it gives us empirical grounding to start talking and training therapists of thinking through cross neurotype interactions through a cross cultural lens of that is how therapists should be approaching so much of the training. It's just kind of gross to hear how you should engage your autistic clients. Like, it is so much more enlivening and expansive to talk about it. Like, this is a cross neurotype interaction, a cross cultural interaction that's happening, leading with intellectual humility and curiosity, as we would in any cross cultural therapeutic dyad.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually interviewed an autistic therapist on my other podcast yesterday, and she was just talking about the frustration around grad school programs really not getting this right.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
honestly, hardly ever fucking talking about it. So
Yeah.
we need to have more courses popping up in grad school programs on how
Mhm.
to work with neurodivergent clients and not just simply a glance
Absolutely.
over of like, oh, yeah, these are some disorders in the DSM.
Well, and when it is talked about, it's typically talked about in children. And here's the thing is, like, we're in therapy, right? We know that so many of us have PTSD, substance abuse problems, anxiety disorders, depression, like the list goes on and on. We're in therapy. Um, I think programs don't realize that. They don't realize that we're in therapy. We're diagnosed with other things often and we're being treated for other things, but we're there. Um, and programs will really need to be thinking about this in the next, well, yesterday, but in the next 5, 10 years, I really hope that they start seriously considering how do we work with neurodivergent adults?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those neurodivergent kiddos become neurodivergent adults. It's not like,
Hmm.
autistic kiddo, then all of a sudden, no more autism. Um,
Hmm.
I like to think about it as like the ADHD or autism is the foundation of the house, and the PTSD, the substance use, the
Hmm.
depression is the
Hmm.
furniture. And
Ooh, I like that metaphor. That's helpful.
and I
Yeah.
think it all starts to come together when you start to realize like if this is baseline, right? Like this is and then you're experiencing these symptoms of mental health because
Mhm.
of
Right. Mhm.
neurodevelopmental condition.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because then if you're treating the PTSD, so you're getting new furniture, but like the foundation of the house is cracking and breaking because you're not addressing like sensory needs and all these other things. It doesn't matter how much like remodeling you do of the furniture if you're not addressing the foundation and the vulnerabilities there.
Yep. Well, I am gonna segue us out of this because my
Okay.
instinct would be like, so now let's do this thing. But I'm just being aware of time, and I think that this is a wonderful conversation, one that we could have guests on and talk about their own experiences
Mhm.
as autistic therapists and grad school participants, what we would like to have seen differently in school, what we want to see for the future generation. And I think that, if we can continue to all advocate together, then hopefully we can make some fucking change. And again, to those of you who have experienced what Megan brought up, I'm sorry. And I hope that you can find solace in the fact that there are a lot of autistic therapists out there doing this type of work,
Mhm.
openly discussing their livelihoods and sharing their experiences, because I think it's helpful to validate and to help hopefully quote unquote
Mhm.
normalize the human condition experience that we're all having together. So I just want to say thanks for this conversation, Megan. And I'm looking forward to talking about how to find ND affirmative care next week.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you. And that sounds good. And I'm awkward with goodbyes.
I'll take over. So, everyone, thanks for listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast on all major platforms. Weekly episodes out. Like, download, subscribe, and share. We'll see you next week. Thanks.